300 years ago, 17 civilizations lit their skies on fire in celebration. Not from war, not from conquest, from relief. On that night, the species known across the galaxy as the burning kind, humanity was declared extinct, and on 1,000 worlds, people who had never even seen a human being wept with joy because they had been told, for generations, that the day humanity died was the day the galaxy finally became safe. Statues were melted down that night, anthems were rewritten, an entire species' history was quietly moved from the threats archive to the resolved archive, and nobody asked what the difference actually meant. This is the story of what happened on the day they found out. On the ash-colored moon of Threl, in a museum built from the bones of a war nobody living remembered starting, an archivist named Kesaven lit a single candle every year on the anniversary of humanity's silence. Nobody asked her why. They assumed it was ritual, grief's quiet cousin, the way funerals sometimes double as celebration. Mourning the cost of a victory, nobody regretted winning. They were wrong about that too. Kessa was Ashen, kin, one of the 7 founding species of what the histories called the Concord, the alliance that had, 300 years ago, finally driven the last human warship out past the Kuiper Veil and watched its beacon go dark. No transmissions after that, no wreckage, no survivors reported on any of the listening arrays strung across 17 systems for 3 unbroken centuries. Silence was humanity's epitaph. It was carved into monuments in 11 languages. The Concord had built its entire peace on that silence. Children were raised inside it, the way a house is built on bedrock, nobody thinks to check. Songs were written about the long quiet. An entire generation of alien civilizations grew up believing that whatever the burning kind had been, they were gone, and gone was good, and good didn't need to be questioned twice. Kessa's candle wasn't for grief. It was a question she couldn't stop asking, alone, once a year, in a room nobody else visited. What if gone was never the same word as dead? Nobody wanted to hear that question out loud. It unsettled things that had taken 300 years to settle. So she asked it to a candle instead, and the candle never answered. Until the year it didn't have to, because something else answered for it. The listening array on Threl's dark side picked up the signal at 0:30:40:47 station time. A single ship, decelerating from just outside the system's edge, running lights that hadn't been manufactured by anyone in 300 years. Human hull design, human markings, sun-bleached and hand-repainted more than once. And a human voice, broadcasting on an open channel in a language most of the galaxy had only ever heard replayed in museum archives, slowed down for translation classes. This is the vessel Providence. We are not hostile. We are asking to come home. If this story has you hooked, hit subscribe. Now you will not want to miss what happens next. That single word detonated across 17 worlds faster than any weapon the burning kind had ever built during the war that ended them. Because home only meant one of 2 things, and both were terrifying in different directions. Either this was the last drifting scrap of a species already dead, a ghost ship on autopilot, harmless, tragic, easily explained away by morning, or humanity had never actually died at all, and everything the galaxy had built its 3 centuries of peace on top of was a story it had told itself because the truth was too inconvenient to keep investigating. Kessa was the 3rd person to reach the command deck of the Concord's listening station that night, and the first to say the sentence nobody else wanted to say out loud. We don't actually know what happened to them. We only know what happened to us. The station commander, a broad-shouldered Threl native named Orson Dahl, didn't like that sentence one bit. His jaw worked like he was chewing on it before he spoke. They lost the war, Archivist. 17 fleets watched them lose it. I've seen the footage. So have you. We watched them leave, Kessa said. That was never proof of what happened after. Nobody answered her. Around them, station lights dimmed as power rerouted to the long-range sensors, and somewhere past the moon's curve, the ship kept coming, patient as a held breath. To understand why an entire galaxy had celebrated a species' death like a holiday, you first have to understand what humanity had supposedly done to earn that kind of hatred. The war hadn't started with humans. Every serious historian in the Concord agreed on that much, at least in the footnotes nobody read aloud. It started with a mining dispute in a system nobody important cared about. A misfire that killed 9 miners, a retaliation strike that killed 40 more, and a spiral that took 6 years to become unrecognizable from where it began. But humanity had finished that war in a way nobody in the Concorde could forgive, even 3 centuries later. When the combined Concorde fleet finally cornered what remained of the human military along a stretch of dead space called the Ashgrave Line, humanity hadn't surrendered. They hadn't simply fled either, not at first. They had done something the Concorde had no framework to process, then or now. They evacuated everyone first, every non-combatant, every refugee convoy, every colony ship within reach of the front. And only once every civilian hull had cleared the corridor did they turn their remaining warships around and detonate their own fuel and supply lines behind them, collapsing an entire stretch of navigable space to slow the Concorde's advance, trapping their own soldiers inside ships that had no possible path to retreat. 70,000 humans died holding that line, on purpose, knowingly. It bought the rest of humanity 11 years to disappear. The Concorde called what happened there the Ashgrave Massacre and mourned it as an atrocity, a species so alien in its thinking that it would sacrifice its own by the tens of thousands rather than simply lay down its weapons. Humanity, in the few surviving fragments of their own record, had called it something that never translated cleanly into any Concorde language. The closest anyone ever got was the long door, the sacrifice that let everyone else get out alive. Both stories were true at once. That was the entire problem, buried for 300 years under statues and anthems. The galaxy remembered the 70,000 corpses in perfect, aching detail. It never bothered translating the door. So when humanity vanished past the veil 11 years later, and the beacon went dark, nobody in the Concorde thought to ask where they might have gone, or why, or what they might have been running toward instead of merely away from. The galaxy just closed the door behind them, called it justice, and started the countdown to the celebration. The Providence made planetfall on the far side of Threll's largest moon, in full view of 9 Concorde warships that had scrambled into position in the 11 hours since first contact. Engines hot, weapons dark, waiting for a reason to do something everyone on the command deck already had an opinion about. It was a single vessel, old in design, but not decayed, repaired, maintained. Loved the way a blade is kept sharp for 300 years by someone who never once stopped believing they might need it again. 11 humans disembarked onto Threll's ash-gray regolith. Not 70,000. Not an armada. 11, walking slowly, hands visible, the universal grammar of a species that had learned, somewhere along 3 centuries of exile, exactly how frightening they still were to everyone watching. Kessa was allowed onto the negotiation shuttle only because she was the one who had said the sentence nobody else would say, and because someone, somewhere far up the Concorde's chain of command, had quietly decided that a species who might have been wronged deserved to be met, at least once, by somebody willing to admit it out loud. The human who stepped forward to meet her was young, impossibly young, for a member of a species that should have been 3 centuries into extinction. Her name, translated awkwardly through the linguistic array strapped to Kessa's collar, was Iris Okonkwo Reyes. She introduced herself, without ceremony, as 4th generation Providence Line. 4th generation. That was the first answer to a question nobody in the Concorde had thought to ask in 300 years of grieving. What does extinct actually mean for a species built entirely around running? It didn't mean dead. It meant hidden. It meant breeding and building and waiting. Past the veil, in the dark, unmapped spaces between systems the Concorde had never bothered to chart because nobody believed anything could survive out there long enough to matter. 300 years. 4 generations. Enough time for a people who left as refugees to come back as something else entirely, something that no longer flinched at the sight of a Concorde warship because it had spent 3 centuries becoming whatever came after fear. Kessa asked the only question that actually mattered. Why now? Why come back at all after everything we did to you? Iris didn't answer right away. She looked past Kessa's shoulder, toward the 9 warships holding position in low orbit, weapons dark but ready, the way a held breath is ready. Because something is coming, she said finally. Something we ran from twice already, generations before your war even started, and this time we can't outrun it. Nobody can. Not us. Not you. This is where the story could have ended the way the galaxy had spent 300 years expecting it to end, with humanity unmasked as liars or conquerors returning in borrowed peace, a threat wearing the mask of a refugee. That would have been the easy shape. The shape that let everyone keep their old certainties intact, their statues standing, their anthems unchained. It didn't end that way. Because the thing Iris described, the thing humanity had first encountered generations before the Ashgrave War even began, the thing they had never once told the Concord about, because no species that young telling 17 older civilizations that something worse was coming would ever have been, believed, wasn't a metaphor, and it wasn't a bargaining chip. It was a signal older than the Concord, almost certainly older than every species inside it. A slow, migratory pulse moving through the galaxy's outer arm for longer than any recorded civilization had existed to notice it, consuming systems the way weather consumes a coastline, without malice, without even awareness, the way a wildfire doesn't hate the forest it happens to be burning through. Humanity had found it first, entirely by accident, 300 years before the mining dispute that would eventually become the Ashgrave War. They had tried to warn the Concord once, quietly, in the earliest years, long before any resource dispute, before any war, before any of the grief that followed. Nobody had listened. A species that young, warning 17 older civilizations that something far worse than any of them was already moving toward populated space. It had read as fear, mongering at best, or worse, as a manipulative play for sympathy from a species the Concord already distrusted on principle. So humanity had done the only thing left available to them. They kept building in secret. They kept preparing, not to fight the Concord, to survive whatever the Concord couldn't yet see coming. The Ashgrave sacrifice. The 70,000 dead the galaxy had spent 3 centuries mourning as victims of human cruelty, had actually bought time for something no history book had ever recorded, because humanity had calculated correctly that if the Concord's fleet collapsed too quickly under the momentum of that war, whatever was coming from beyond the veil would reach populated, undefended space 11 years sooner than it otherwise would. Nobody had known that. Nobody had ever thought to ask. The galaxy had spent 300 years celebrating a funeral for the wrong death, mourning the wrong casualties, congratulating itself on an ending that had never actually happened. Or Sindal didn't believe any of it, not at first. Belief that large doesn't arrive all at once. It seeps in the way water gets into a hull, slow at first, then all at once, then far too late to bail back out. Prove it, he said, arms crossed, voice flat. Iris didn't argue with him. She simply opened a data channel and let the Concord's own listening arrays, the same instruments that had spent 300 years confirming humanity's silence, sentence by sentence, year by year, pick up what the Providence had been quietly tracking the entire return journey home. A pulse, faint, migratory, 11 light-years out and closing, moving at a pace that made 300 years feel like the length of a single-held breath before the real story finally started. Kessa watched Orson's face while the data resolved across the array in real time. She had spent 300 years, or her whole life, some nights it felt the same, asking one unanswered question to a candle nobody else in the museum would look at twice. She had never once expected the answer to be worse than the question itself. We celebrated, she said quietly, mostly to herself, watching the pulse crawl closer on the display, because it meant we finally didn't have to be afraid of you anymore. Iris heard her anyway. Her voice was gentle, which somehow made it worse. You don't have to be afraid of us. You never did. You just needed something to be afraid of, and we were easier to hate than the dark. Nobody on that command deck had an answer for that. Not Orson, jaw tight, staring at numbers he didn't want to believe. Not the 17 worlds still technically holding their 300-year vigil against a species that, it turned out, had never actually been their enemy in the first place. Just Kessa and her candle, and the question she had never once stopped asking, even when nobody else wanted to hear it. Word spreads faster than warships. By the time Orson Dahl transmitted the raw sensor data up the Concord's chain of command, all 17 founding worlds already knew 3 things. Humanity was alive, humanity had never been the thing they thought it was, and something older than all of them combined was 11 light-years out, and closing. The Concord Council convened within the hour. An emergency session. Delegates patched in from 17 systems, most of them still wearing whatever they'd had on when the alert reached them. Kessa was not supposed to be in that room. Archivists briefed councils. They didn't sit in on them. But Orson, to his credit, walked her in himself and didn't apologize to anyone for it. The debate that followed was ugly in the particular way. Debates get ugly when everyone involved is afraid, and nobody wants to be the one who admits it first. A delegate from the ringed world of Aussay argued that this was exactly the kind of story a returning enemy would tell. Manufacture a greater threat, offer yourself as the only shield against it, and walk back through the very door you were exiled from, wearing the cloak of a savior. It's the oldest maneuver in any war, he said. Convince the guard that the wolf at the door is worse than you are. A younger delegate from Threll's own council, one of Kessa's own people, asked the question that actually mattered, the one Kessa had been circling for 300 years, without anyone in any room willing to say it plainly. And if it isn't a maneuver, if we spend another decade deciding whether to trust the data, and the data turns out to be real? Nobody had an answer for that either. Iris did not speak during the debate. She had been asked to wait outside, and she waited, standing very still at the edge of the corridor, watching through a window as 17 worlds argued over whether her species' 300-year exile had been a war crime or a warning nobody had wanted to hear. Kessa found her there afterward, once the council adjourned without a vote, kicking the decision 11 hours further down the line, the way frightened institutions always did. They didn't believe you, Kessa said. It wasn't really a question. They didn't believe the data, Iris said. That's different. Belief's the easy part. It's the acting on it that takes longer than anyone thinks they have. She looked at Kessa for a long moment, and something in her expression softened, just slightly, the way ice softens right before it starts to move. You believe something once with nothing to back it up but a candle. That's rarer than you think it is. Kessa didn't know what to say to that, so she said the truth instead. I didn't believe you'd come back. I only ever believed the silence didn't prove what everyone said it proved. That's the same thing, Iris said. You just didn't know it yet. They stood together at the window while the council chamber emptied out behind them. Delegates from 17 worlds filing into corridors built to commemorate a victory that had never actually happened, past murals of a war whose ending nobody in that building had understood correctly until tonight. Outside, past the ash-gray curve of the moon, the Providence's running lights kept burning in the dark, patient as they had always been. The galaxy did not celebrate a second time. There was no ceremony held for what Iris had brought back with her across 300 years of exile. No songs written for the Providence's return, no monuments raised for 11 humans who had crossed a quarter of a millennium to warn a galaxy that had spent that same stretch of time quietly hoping never to hear from them again. There was only a single candle, still burning on a dark moon, lit by an archivist who had asked the right question for what felt like the wrong number of years, and a fleet of 9 warships that slowly, hull by hull, powered down their weapons and opened their landing bays instead, because for the first time in 3 centuries, nobody in the Concord could think of a single reason left to keep them closed. Humanity had not returned as ghosts, not as liars, not as conquerors wearing the borrowed language of peace. They had returned as the only ones left who still remembered what the rest of the galaxy had chosen, gratefully to forget that extinct and silent were never actually the same word, and that sometimes the door a species closes behind itself isn't running away from something. It's holding the line in front of it. 300 years ago, the galaxy celebrated humanity's extinction and called the silence that followed peace. They never knew they were celebrating the exact moment humanity lost the ability to warn them. Now the warning had come back anyway, carried across 3 centuries by 4 generations of people who had never stopped believing someone, eventually, would need to hear it. And somewhere past the Kuiper Veil, in a stretch of space none of the Concord's arrays had ever bothered to chart, the thing humanity had spent 300 years running from kept closing the distance, patient, blind, and utterly indifferent to whether the galaxy had decided to believe in it yet. The candle was still burning when Kessa finally asked the last question, the one none of them had an answer for yet. How long do we have? Iris didn't look away from the dark between the stars, the place where the pulse kept crawling closer with every second nobody spent arguing. Less time than it took you to stop hating us, she said quietly, so I'd start believing us quickly, Archivist, all of you. Behind her, The Providence's running lights flickered once against the black. Old lights, 3 centuries old, still burning. Still, against every reasonable expectation the galaxy had ever held, coming home.